Good day. Welcome to the 2022 Scandinavian Folk Festival in Jamestown, New York. My name is John Jones, and I've been researching the early Swedish settlers in the Jamestown area. Today I'll be talking about early Swedish immigrants who came through Boston en route to northwestern Pennsylvania and western New York. Most Swedish settlers in the Jamestown area arrived through New York City, but during the 1850s, some settlers arrived through other ports, especially Boston. A small number arrived in Philadelphia, and an undocumented number arrived in Quebec. My research is presented at jamestownswedes.org. The talk today is based on research from my blog about coyotes and good shepherds, who our Swedish ancestors encountered during their migration to America. I'll be talking about three topics. Later, I want to discuss Peter F. Williston and his role in protecting Swedish immigrants in the port of Boston. And then I want to talk about the New England Scandinavian Benevolent Relief Society and its most peculiar member, Dr. Charles W. Roback. But first, I want to explain why Swedish immigrants arrived in the port of Boston. The earliest Swedish immigrants came to America aboard cargo ships carrying Swedish iron. This is a painting of an iron yard in Stockholm in the 1830s. As early as 1828, Swedish iron was being advertised locally in Chautauqua County, and on the left is a newspaper clipping from the Jamestown Journal of that year. A distinction of the Swedish iron industry was its use of maker's marks to identify the source of the product. In the center is the Ryfors Bruk maker's mark. Swedish iron was generally preferred because of its carbon content. England's Sheffield steel commonly used Swedish bar iron as its source. The Swedes' iron, advertised in the Jamestown Journal, was usually in the form of iron bars of varying thicknesses and lengths that were used by local blacksmiths and tool makers. Of course, edge tools including axes, adzes, froes, and knives were essential in the settlement and development of Chautauqua and Warren counties. Olaf Wieck was a merchant who became a significant exporter of Swedish iron to America and an important owner of a fleet of ships. He had traveled through North America in 1829, learning about the industries here. Wieck was the owner of the Swedish bark Virginia that brought the first group of Swedes to the Jamestown area, first arriving in New York City in 1846. The building with the domed tower at the left in this photograph was the home and offices of Olaf Wieck. It is located on the Central Canal in Old Göteborg. The port of Göteborg provided only rough accommodations for Swedes who were emigrating. The date for the arrival of the ships in Göteborg was unpredictable, and the time required to unload and then reload the ships also varied. This left groups of emigrants waiting for some time in Göteborg area, adding cost to their travels. This photograph of the harbor is from 1863. Ship owners interested in taking emigrants to America advertised in Göteborg, and sometimes announcements appeared in print in Linköping. America was only generally known in Sweden, and notices about Boston often noted that it was Boston in North America rather than the one in England. The 1848 advertisement on the left was for passage to Boston on the Augusta, the sister ship of the Virginia, in 1846. In the middle is a notice of the arrival in 1849 of the Monona in Boston that was printed in the Östergötland newspaper. The advertisement on the right, from 1851, was in the Göteborg shipping newspaper and advertised ships going to New York and Boston for emigrants. This photograph is of the whaler Charles W. Morgan, still afloat and at Mystic Seaport Museum in Mystic, Connecticut. The Charles W. Morgan is a bark of comparable size, rigging, and age to the ships that brought the first Swedes to the Jamestown area. This map helps to explain the transit from Göteborg to America and why Boston and Quebec were alternatives to New York City. The route in orange is to Quebec. The estimated travel time to Liverpool was 25 days sailing from New York City, 22 or 23 days sailing from Boston, but only 20 days from Quebec, including a long protected passage sailing through the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Protection along the coast prevailing winds, and the hurricane season all played a role in determining these routes. Swedish ships from Göteborg crossed the Atlantic using two routes. The solid red line shows the route through the North Sea and then north of Scotland. The dashed lines show routes south through the English Channel or transshipment by rail to Liverpool or Glasgow. Scandinavian sailors are a part of Massachusetts maritime history. An example that doesn't fit within our usual Swedish immigrant histories is Captain James Sandbury. He arrived much later than the Swedes of the colonial period and much earlier than the liberalization of Swedish emigration rules in 1840. Captain Sandbury was born in Sweden in 1782 and worked in America as a ship captain. He lived in Nantucket and married Anne Cleveland there in 1808. By the 1840s and 50s, there was already a small community of Scandinavians in Boston. Many histories indicate that Daniel Larson began a settlement in the Boston area in 1844. However, Niels William Olson found that this community was never permanent, and those who arrived with Larson moved west. Larson returned to Sweden but came back to America in 1851 when he settled in North Bridgewater and then in nearby Campello. Campello was later incorporated as part of the city of Brockton. In 1868, Larson then moved to Goodhue County, Minnesota, but by then a permanent Swedish community had formed. Jamestown Swedes had close ties to the Swedish community that developed in Brockton, Massachusetts in the 1870s and later. The earliest documented Swedish immigrants who settled in our area and arrived by way of Boston came in July 1850 aboard the Monona. The Monona was owned by C.G. Lindbergh, one of Olaf Wieck's major competitors. During the early period of Swedish migration to the Jamestown area, New York City was the principal port of entry, but Boston was significant in several years. The totals represented in this graph are for Swedes whose arrival in America and settlement in the Jamestown area I have been able to document. However, there are two complications in these aggregates and for researchers of their family history. First, the records of Boston are often incomplete and many are missing during the mid-1850s. And second, Quebec became an entry point for some Swedes. There are almost no immigration records for Canada available before 1865, making it nearly impossible to track and document Swedes entering by way of Quebec or other ports. The increased traffic of emigrants from Sweden shifted the size of the ships carrying our ancestors. Direct cargo ships were replaced by transshipment to packet ships leaving from Liverpool, Hamburg, and Bremen, and later by dedicated passenger ships as the common carrier of emigrants. The first Swedes to arrive in our area by steamship were 11 emigrants from Skiro Parish, including John Sampson and his family. They arrived at Castle Garden in New York City on July 17, 1858, aboard the steamship Austria from Hamburg. Now I'd like to turn our attention to Peter F. Williston and his assistance of passengers in Boston Harbor. Aside from a quarantine hospital at Deer Island, there were no facilities in Boston for immigrants who arrived during this era before the Civil War. This left arriving immigrants open to schemers, thieves, and scoundrels, often an abrupt welcome to America, the land of opportunists. The local Scandinavian community, who were already established in Boston and Cambridge, assisted immigrants, especially Peter F. Williston. Peter Frederick Williston was born on February 15, 1812, in Sälvborg, Blekingeland. His father died when Peter was only 5 years old, so he grew up in assisted housing with his mother in Sälvborg. At age 20, Peter received permission to emigrate from Sälvborg to North America. Peter and two cousins traveled with another cousin, Johan Holmberg, aboard the bark Ellen from Helsingør and arrived in Boston on September 20, 1832. Holmberg was returning to Boston, but it's unclear when Holmberg had first gone to America. In Boston, Willström anglicized his name to Peter F. Williston. In 1838, he married Louise Burr in Boston. She died after giving birth to their first child, Louisa, in 1839. In 1840, Williston remarried, to Margaret Brown of Maine. Through the 1840s and 50s, Peter Williston was a tailor in Boston. In 1862, he became a customs inspector in Boston Harbor. After retirement, he made his home near his daughter in Natick, Massachusetts. He died in Natick in 1880. Peter Williston is featured in Reverend Erland Carlson's 1854 Guide for Emigrants, which was printed in Vasio. In it, Carlson noted, "In Boston, our countrymen have had much help from a Swede named Williston, and in general, those who have made the journey through that city have enjoyed good treatment." Williston's tailor shop in Quincy Market was only a couple blocks away from the busy port. Like Joseph Morel in Buffalo, this proximity of Williston's shop to the harbor likely got him involved with assisting Swedish immigrants. Williston became an important asset in Boston for arriving Swedes, and he was likely involved in some manner with all the arriving ships from Sweden. However, Williston's efforts weren't entirely altruistic. Williston was a representative of the Boston Worcester Railroad and received a commission for all ticket sales to the immigrants he steered their way. In the 1850s, railroads began adding emigrant cars to their slow-moving mail trains. The route of the Boston and Worcester Railroad between Boston and Albany is shown with the red dashed line on this map. Their competitors, the Fitchburg Railroad, had a longer, more circuitous route through central Vermont on their way to Albany. That route is shown with an orange dashed line. These locations in Boston are significant in the work of Peter Williston. Number 1 is the location of Williston's tailor shop near Quincy Market. Number 2 is the later location of his shop on Tremont Row. Number 3 is Long Wharf, the principal dock of Boston. Number 4 is Boston's Customs House, central to the port activities in the harbor of Boston. Number 5 is the Boston and Worcester Railroad Terminal. And number 6 is the Fitchburg Railroad Terminal. This sketch of the Swedish immigrant parade through the streets of Boston was published in Harper's Weekly Pictorial Magazine in 1852. It shows the passengers from the Swedish bark Ambrosia as they traveled from their ship to the Boston and Worcester Railroad Terminal. The armed parade was organized by Williston and served to protect the immigrants from thieves during their transfer from the ship to the railroad, and to promote local sympathy and support in Boston for Scandinavian immigrants through supportive news articles. I would like to highlight 2 episodes involving Williston: the voyage of the schooner Ellen Perkins and the ship Sagadahoc. Swedish newspapers reported that the Ellen Perkins left Göteborg in June 1852 with 113 passengers on board. The Ellen Perkins was a small American ship rigged as a schooner that was legally capable of transporting 54 passengers by the regulations of the United States Steerage Act of 1819. Their voyage took twice as long as what was usual, and instead of arriving in Boston, the American captain took his schooner around Cape May, and after 92 days at sea, finally docked at Martha's Vineyard. After resupplying on Martha's Vineyard, the schooner proceeded to Fall River, Massachusetts, with 104 on board. No deaths were reported to customs officials, and the ship was not impounded. The owner and captain of the Ellen Perkins, Joseph P. Blevins, was not jailed or fined. The citizens of Fall River gave aid to the weary Swedes, and Peter F. Williston arrived from Boston to assist that effort. This is an excerpt from a short biography of Samuel Monson published in A History of Carver County, Minnesota in 1910. Monson and his family had lived briefly in Warren County in the 1850s before migrating to Carver County, just north of Minneapolis. Monson's biography noted that they had spent some time in Fall River, Massachusetts before making their way to our area. This made no sense within what was normal during this period, until I learned of Peter Williston's assistance to passengers of the Ellen Perkins in Fall River. In 1853, the American ship Sagadahoc had the misfortune of leaving Göteborg harbor just as cholera had arrived from Denmark. Cholera in the summer of 1853 killed hundreds in Göteborg. Aboard the Sagadahoc, their infected water killed 59 passengers before the conditions became controlled. By the time the Sagadahoc arrived in Boston, its many deaths had already been reported in newspapers throughout the United States. The ship was put into quarantine when it arrived. Boston had just opened a hospital for quarantine on Deer Island, so the Swedish immigrants aboard the Sagadahoc were some of the first patients at that hospital. This is a pictorial guide to the Deer Island Hospital published in 1856. The hospital was run by the port physician, who was Dr. John Moriarty. As with the previous arrivals, Peter Williston organized a parade of the immigrants from the Sagadahoc once they were released from quarantine. That parade of Swedes traveled by way of City Hall, where Williston was presented with a silver tray and pitcher in honor of his assistance to the Swedes. From the mayor's office, the parade continued on to the Boston and Worcester Railroad Station. News of the parade once again was published in local newspapers. Peter Williston was part of a group formed in 1853 to assist Scandinavian immigrants arriving in Boston. The New England Scandinavian Benevolent Relief Society was loosely organized in 1853 and incorporated under Massachusetts law in 1855. It continued as an active organization assisting Scandinavians until 1934. The Society's records are included in the collection of the American Swedish History Museum in Philadelphia. Their first president was Francis Stromberg, who was a master gilder and picture frame maker from Stockholm. Williston was elected vice president and was also a major contributor. After its incorporation in 1855, new leadership took over the society and it named Niels Nielsen as its official representative in Massachusetts. Nielsen was an agent of the Fitchburg Railroad line. Animosity between Nielsen and Williston resulted in a fight in the harbor in 1855, the arrest of Nielsen, and subsequent lawsuits. To deal with Nielsen as a competitor, Williston got himself appointed as a special policeman for the Boston Harbor, specializing in Swedish immigrants and sailors. This allowed Williston to board ships before any others, including the agent Nielsen. Now I want to turn my attention to another founder of the New England Scandinavian Benevolent Relief Society and its largest financial supporter, Dr. Charles W. Roback. Roback was born Carl Johan Nielsen in Kristalla in Kalmar län in 1811. After a series of failed businesses, Roback became a con man, and he was sentenced in absentia to 5 years in prison in 1843. By that time, he had emigrated to America, leaving behind his wife and children. He likely arrived in the port of Baltimore. In Baltimore, or later in Philadelphia, he reinvented himself as Dr. Charles W. Roback. In 1856, the Swedish journalist Carl Axel Egerstrom visited Roback in Boston. Egerstrom wrote articles that were published in Sweden. Roback and his exploits, known as Fajebogek in his homeland, became infamous in Sweden. In America, Roback married Mary Sinnickson of Mount Holly, New Jersey. And in 1867, Roback died a relatively wealthy man in Cincinnati, Ohio. He is buried next to his wife in Mount Holly Cemetery. Charles W. Roback was possibly known as William Williams in Baltimore, but by 1847 he had arrived in Philadelphia. By 1850 he had been convicted there for fraud, and in 1851 Roback had moved on to New York City. He then moved on to Boston, where in 1854 Roback self-published his autobiography, The Mysteries of Astrology and the Wonders of Magic. Roback's book included chapters on astrology and many other subjects, as well as stories about supernatural experiences. Roback's autobiography is fanciful. It notes that he was of noble birth, the seventh son of the seventh son of the seventh son, and grew up in a castle in Sweden. It included Nordic imagery of Vikings, snow, and sleighs. Roback left Boston for Montreal and then finally settled in Cincinnati. Roback, other astrologists, patent medicine makers, and the like had a special relationship with newspapers in America in the 1800s. These charlatans consistently advertised their services in newspapers, and publishers who counted on this income were reluctant to question the legitimacy of these advertisers. But in Philadelphia, Roback gained notoriety because of articles questioning his reputation published in a rival newspaper. Roback left town for New York City. After some success in the East, Charles Roback found great success in Cincinnati with a line of Scandinavian cures. Roback's line of patent medicines became well known and continued in production for more than a decade after his death. To promote his elixirs and cures, Dr. Charles W. Roback published an almanac in the 1860s. Charles W. Roback is not who we imagine when we think about Swedish immigrants. Nonetheless, after his death in 1867, lengthy obituaries appeared in many Swedish-language newspapers in the United States and in newspapers in Sweden. And through some sort of alignment of the stars, his time in Boston led to the formation of a benevolent society that served the Scandinavian community for 8 decades. Thanks for supporting the Scandinavian Folk Festival here in Jamestown, and for your interest in our local immigrant history.